A pattern shift is arriving across Europe just as summer gives way to autumn, and for once the news leans in a favorable direction for large parts of the continent. Meteorologist Brian Shields, presenting his latest outlook on Saturday, August 22nd, 2026, laid out a September that will run both hotter than average and encouragingly for drought. Stricken regions, wetter than average. It is an unusual combination on paper, but one that makes sense once the underlying atmospheric setup and the influence of a strong El Nino event are taken into account. The outlook stretches from the first days of September all the way through the back half of October, giving viewers a rare long look at how the transition from summer into autumn is likely to unfold. The starting point for the forecast is the here and now. Over the past several days, a series of weather fronts have swept across the continent, bringing rounds of rain and introducing noticeable kinks, or what Shields calls wrinkles, into the jet stream. Those disturbances have already produced real-world impacts, including heavier flooding in parts of Italy. This unsettled short-term pattern is the backdrop against which the September change will occur, and it sets up a useful contrast. What has been happening lately is not necessarily what is coming next. As the calendar turns into September, and specifically through roughly the first week of the month, forecasters expect a bit of ridging to develop in the jet stream. This is not the same intensity of ridging that dominated during the peak of summer, but it is enough to matter. A ridge in the jet stream essentially means the flow lifts northward in a given region, and when that happens, areas of high pressure tend to build in underneath it. High pressure systems are typically associated with clearer skies, lighter winds, and warmer conditions, so the emergence of this ridging is the mechanism driving the above average temperatures forecast for large stretches of the month. It's worth being precise about what above average means here, because this is not a repeat of the extreme heat waves that defined parts of the summer. Shields draws a direct comparison to the outlook issued back in June, which correctly anticipated a major, prolonged heat event. September's warmth is described as more subtle and more gradual. Yes, temperatures will generally trend downward as the season changes and the sun angle lowers, which is entirely normal for the time of year. But layered on top of that seasonal cooling trend is a persistent lean toward warmer than normal conditions in most locations, punctuated by a few brief, sharper pulses of heat rather than one sustained heat wave. It helps to understand why a ridge produces these effects in the first place. The jet stream is essentially a river of fast-moving air high in the atmosphere that steers weather systems from west to east across the mid-latitudes, including all of Europe. When that river of air is relatively flat, storm systems tend to move through in a fairly orderly, progressive fashion, bringing regular rounds of cloud and rain. When the jet stream instead develops a ridge, a northward bulge in its path, air beneath that bulge tends to sink. Sinking air warms as it compresses, skies tend to clear, and storm systems get deflected around the high pressure rather than moving directly through it. That is the basic physical reason a ridging jet stream translates into a stretch of warmer, drier, more settled weather for whichever region sits underneath it. And it's the same mechanism, just less extreme, that produced the major summer heat wave referenced earlier in the outlook. Not every corner of Europe will share in that warmth, however. Scotland stands out as one of the areas likely to run cooler than average through the month, with that cooler signal extending northeastward toward parts of Norway. This is not entirely unexpected, given the typical position of these regions relative to the jet stream and areas of low pressure, but it is worth flagging because it means the September story is not simply warm everywhere. There will be a real north-south, and to some extent northwest-southeast, split in how the month plays out. Breaking the month down into more granular chunks helps clarify how this evolves week by week. For the first week of September, the ridging in the jet stream is expected to support what Shields describes as a few pockets of unusually warm conditions, even a couple of mini heat waves. The areas most likely to see this include parts of the islands and stretches over toward Italy, where deeper orange shading on the temperature anomaly maps points to the most pronounced warmth relative to normal. Comparing this week specifically against the long-term average, Scotland is running roughly 2 degrees below average, reinforcing the cooler pocket mentioned earlier. Ireland, by contrast, sits close to average, illustrated by white shading on the map, which suggests a fairly gradual, unremarkable transition there rather than a sharp swing in either direction. Norway also trends a degree or so below average during this first week, continuing the cooler theme in the north. Moving east and south changes the picture considerably. Around Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, temperatures are expected to run modestly above average. The Iberian Peninsula stands out even more, with Portugal and Spain both showing anomalies of 2 to 3 degrees above average during the first week of September. This region is specifically flagged as one of the more likely spots to experience one of those short mini heat waves as the month begins. Meanwhile, a broad swath of Central Europe, including Poland, Czechia, and Germany, is expected to sit close to average, with the map showing mostly neutral, whitish shading, and no dramatic departures in either direction. Italy shows a more nuanced pattern. Areas near the Alps tend to track closer to normal, while central and southern Italy push toward 2 degrees above average. Continuing east, Hungary and Romania are highlighted as likely to see some of the larger positive anomalies of the week, running roughly 2 to 3 degrees above average. The second stretch of the outlook, covering roughly the 9th through the 16th of September, looks broadly similar to the first week in terms of overall structure. Much of Europe continues to trend above average, with a comparable magnitude of warmth to what was seen in the opening days of the month. There are some subtle shifts worth noting, though. The area of deeper orange shading, indicating the strongest warm anomalies, becomes a bit more pronounced back toward Spain, suggesting Iberia continues to be a focal point for above-average warmth. Meanwhile, attention swings toward Eastern Europe as well, where temperatures are expected to run substantially warmer than average, potentially supporting another short 2 to 3 day pulse of heat, similar in character to the pattern already described for the first week, but shifted geographically to the east. By the third stretch of the month, roughly the 17th through the 24th, the north-south contrast becomes even more distinct in places. Scotland and Norway continue to sit close to average, while Sweden becomes something of a split zone, with parts of the country trending warmer and parts trending near normal, essentially half and half depending on location. Meanwhile, areas including the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium are expected to run clearly above average, shown by orange shading across those regions. As the outlook extends toward the very end of the month, the broad theme remains consistent with what has already been described. Most locations across Europe continue to trend above average for the temperature, even as the calendar pushes deeper into what is traditionally a cooling transitional time of year. Temperature, though, is only half of the September story, and arguably the less consequential half for many parts of the continent, given how persistent drought conditions have become in recent months. The rainfall outlook carries real significance because so many areas across Europe remain abnormally dry. The encouraging news is that September is expected to bring at least a partial break from that dryness in a number of regions, even though some areas will remain drier than they should be. This is where the influence of El Nino becomes especially relevant, and it's worth pausing to explain what that actually is. El Nino refers to a periodic warming of ocean water out in the eastern Pacific, far removed geographically from Europe. Despite that distance, a strong El Nino event, like the one currently locked in and confirmed through the red shading on the probability maps referenced in the outlook, can still influence weather patterns well beyond the Pacific Basin through a kind of ripple effect across the broader atmospheric circulation. Shields is careful to note that El Nino does not fundamentally alter European weather patterns from scratch, but it can meaningfully enhance certain existing tendencies. During the summer months, that influence tends to lean toward hot and dry conditions, which lines up with what much of Europe has already experienced. But as the calendar advances into autumn and eventually toward early winter, that same El Nino influence is expected to trend the pattern toward wetter conditions. In other words, the same climate driver that helped fuel the summer's heat and dryness is now expected to work in Europe's favor as the season progresses, gradually increasing the odds of meaningful rainfall. It's also worth putting this particular El Nino event in context. Shields notes that the signs pointing toward a strong event were already visible back in the spring, and that those early indications have since been borne out by how the season has actually unfolded. The strength of an El Nino event matters a great deal for how far its effects reach, and how reliably they show up in seasonal outlooks. A weaker borderline event might produce only a faint, inconsistent nudge on European weather, easily overwhelmed by other factors in the atmosphere. A strong event, on the other hand, tends to leave a more consistent fingerprint, which is part of why this particular outlook leans with more confidence on the idea of a wetter autumn and early winter following the current hot, dry stretch. The red shading on the probability maps referenced earlier isn't just a formality. It reflects a genuinely high confidence among the models being tracked that this event will remain strong through the September, October, and November period and carry on into the winter months. Looking at the September precipitation outlook specifically, the geographic pattern is a mixed bag, much like the temperature outlook. Areas shaded green, and in some cases blue, on the precipitation maps are expected to see wetter than average conditions through the month. Areas shaded brown are expected to run below average, and where that shading deepens to red, it signals a more significant rainfall deficit. Norway presents something of a forecasting puzzle in this outlook. Shields notes an element of uncertainty there, explaining that the specific model being used, a European model, may be underselling the moisture potential for parts of Norway. He's transparent about his process here, describing how he typically reviews multiple models, weighs what's happening in the broader atmospheric environment, and then selects the guidance he believes is most likely to verify. In this case, he suspects the reality may bring somewhat more moisture to parts of Norway than the featured model is currently indicating. Elsewhere, the wetter trend extends across a notable stretch of northern Europe, with the green shading reaching back toward Finland, indicating slightly above average moisture there as well. That same wetter signal continues back toward Scotland, Northern Ireland, Ireland, and Wales. England, however, tells a somewhat different story. While the country will still see rounds of rain through September, the overall moisture signal backs off closer to average as you move toward London specifically, in contrast to the wetter conditions expected further north and west. There are practical implications tied to this uneven moisture recovery that go beyond the maps themselves. For agriculture, a return of meaningful rainfall in places like Ireland, Wales, and parts of Scandinavia could help replenish soil moisture ahead of autumn planting and support pasture recovery after a long, dry stretch. Water utilities and reservoir managers in those same affected regions are also very likely to welcome the change. Since summer dryness had already begun straining supplies in several areas, and even a partial recovery heading into autumn can meaningfully ease pressure on those systems before the heavy demands of winter set in. For England, and London in particular, the more muted moisture signal means any relief from summer dryness is likely to be slower and less pronounced than in neighboring regions, which could keep water restrictions or usage guidance in place longer than in areas further north and west. Not every region is expected to catch a break from the dryness, though, and this is where some real concern remains. The Alps region is flagged as a specific area of worry, with rainfall potentially running as much as 60 millimeters below average for the month. That deficit carries consequences beyond just September itself, since it has direct implications for how the eventual snowfall season develops in that region. Moving further east, the outlook becomes more concerning still. Shields reiterates a warning he first raised months earlier, back in the spring, that autumn would likely bring continued difficulty with wildfires and drought conditions in Eastern Europe. With the September outlook confirming both warmer than average temperatures and drier than average conditions for much of the east, that earlier concern is proving well-founded. The combination of heat and limited rainfall means wildfire risk, ongoing drought, and low river levels all remain pressing issues that need continued monitoring across the eastern half of the continent, even as autumn technically arrives. For the wildfire-prone areas of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean fringe, the continuation of warm, dry conditions through much of September means fire agencies and land managers will likely need to maintain heightened readiness, well past the point where, in an average year, the risk might already be easing. Low river levels compound the problem since reduced flow limits water availability for both firefighting response and continued agricultural irrigation, creating a feedback loop that a single wet week is unlikely to break. This is precisely the kind of scenario Shields flagged as a concern months earlier, and the September outlook confirms that the underlying drivers behind it, namely persistent warmth paired with a rainfall deficit, remain firmly in place for that part of the continent. Snow enters the conversation toward the tail end of September, though its arrival is expected to be gradual rather than a defined event. Deep into the final stretch of the month, certain higher elevation or otherwise favorable areas could begin seeing accumulations in the range of 25 to 30 centimeters. However, because the broader pattern is trending drier than average, at least to start, the buildup of meaningful snowfall may be somewhat slow to get going in some locations, even as temperatures eventually cool enough to support it. Returning to the El Nino discussion helps tie the temperature and precipitation threads together into a coherent seasonal narrative. The general expectation with a strong El Nino influence is a hot finish to summer, followed by continued above-average temperatures as the pattern transitions into autumn. That is precisely what the September temperature outlook shows, reinforcing the connection between the large-scale climate driver and the regional forecast details already discussed. The forecast also calls for a couple of those brief, mini-autumn heat waves, particularly in the first and second weeks of September, in specific regions like Iberia and Eastern Europe, which again aligns with the broader El Nino-influenced pattern. On the moisture side, rain chances are expected to gradually increase as the month progresses, and importantly, that increase is expected to continue and even accelerate further as the calendar pushes deeper into autumn and eventually into the winter months. This is consistent with how El Niño's influence on Europe is understood to evolve over the course of a season, starting hot and dry in summer and gradually shifting toward a wetter pattern as autumn deepens. With September largely mapped out, the outlook extends one step further to offer a preview of October, giving a sense of how the broader seasonal trend continues to unfold beyond the immediate month ahead. Temperature-wise, October is expected to remain above average for much of Europe, continuing the theme established in September. There is an important nuance here, though. As October progresses, more weather systems are expected to begin arriving off the Atlantic, and those systems should help knock down some of the persistent warmth in places, introducing more variability than was seen through September. Even so, the October snapshot shows widespread orange shading on the temperature maps, consistent with the broader pattern of above-average warmth that tends to accompany an El Niño-influenced setup across Europe during this part of the year. On the precipitation side, October is expected to bring a noticeable shift toward increased moisture, particularly across the Mediterranean. This represents a meaningful change from the drier conditions that have persisted through much of the summer and into early autumn, and it's a trend that Shields indicates he will continue monitoring closely as it develops. That said, the improvement is not universal. Moving further east, the outlook continues to show yellow shading on the precipitation maps, indicating a continuation of drier than average conditions, and, by extension, a continuation of the drought problems that have already been highlighted as a significant concern for that part of the continent. Coastal areas around the Mediterranean, however, are specifically called out as a region where rain chances should continue building as October unfolds. This distinction between the Mediterranean coast and inland or eastern areas further reinforces just how patchy the drought recovery is likely to be across the continent. It's not simply a case of the wet season starting on a single date and moisture arriving uniformly everywhere at once. Instead, the recovery appears set to begin at the edges, particularly along Mediterranean coastal zones where increased storm activity and a shift in the broader atmospheric pattern first start to take hold, before gradually working its way further inland and eastward over the following weeks and months. For anyone tracking drought conditions in a specific location, that means the timeline for meaningful relief could vary considerably depending on proximity to the coast versus more continental or eastern areas still under the sway of the drier pattern. Stepping back to summarize the season as a whole, the general picture that emerges is one of contrasts layered within an overall warm and, in many places, gradually improving moisture trend. Some areas, mainly across the north and northwest, including Scotland and parts of Scandinavia, will run below average, both in terms of temperature and, in some cases, precipitation timing. But the majority of Europe is expected to experience warmer than average conditions through September, even as the natural seasonal cooling associated with the shift from summer into autumn continues in the background. Rather than a sharp, sudden drop in temperatures as summer ends, the transition is expected to be comparatively gentle, tempered by the persistent warmth working against the usual seasonal decline. On the moisture front, meaningful relief is beginning to arrive in a number of regions that have badly needed it, representing a genuinely positive development for areas that have struggled with drought conditions throughout the summer. That said, the full extent of the recovery is still to come. October and the months beyond, stretching into November and December, are expected to bring an even more pronounced increase in moisture as the El Nino-driven wet pattern continues to strengthen through autumn and toward the start of winter. Alongside that gradual increase in rainfall, attention will also turn toward the eventual return of meaningful snowfall across higher elevation regions, though exactly how quickly that snow accumulation builds back in will require ongoing observation as the season progresses. For those making plans around this outlook, whether that means scheduling outdoor events, deciding when to plant or harvest, or simply figuring out what to pack for a trip, the overall message is fairly clear. Early and mid-September should be treated as an extension of summer in terms of clothing and outdoor comfort across most of the continent, particularly in Iberia and stretches of Eastern Europe where the mini heat waves are most likely to materialize. Northern areas, including Scotland and Norway, will feel more like a typical transition into autumn, with cooler air and a higher chance of rain at any given time. By the final third of the month, even the warmer regions should begin to feel more like early autumn, even if the numbers on the thermometer remain a degree or two above what's typical for the date. Taken together, this outlook paints a picture of a September that, while still warm by historical standards and still carrying real drought and wildfire concerns in parts of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean basin, also offers a genuine and welcome shift toward wetter conditions for many other regions after a long, dry summer stretch. The strong El Nino event now locked in for the coming months appears to be functioning as expected, reinforcing warmth in the near term while setting the stage for a wetter autumn and early winter. As always with seasonal outlooks of this kind, the broad patterns described here, the ridging, the warm anomalies, the shifting moisture trends, are more reliable than any single day's forecast, and continued monitoring through September and into October will help refine exactly how these trends play out region by region as the season advances. For now, the headline is a reassuring one for much of Europe. A gentler, more gradual slide out of summer than the abrupt swings seen in recent years, a handful of short-lived warm spells rather than another prolonged punishing heat event like the one seen back in June. And, at long last, the early signs of a real and sustained turn toward wetter weather for many of the regions that have needed it most.